Well, I think we'll get started. We may have a few more people coming in, but that's fine. We have seats for them, but not many. I'm delighted to see so many out for such a wonderful evening. It's a great pleasure to be able to inaugurate this inaugural moment, in a way, where our new director across the street at the Center for Study of World Religions has agreed to give a kind of inaugural lecture for his directorship, which I don't think we've had in recent memory, and I think it's quite a wonderful thing that he's willing to do that. Let me just say a couple words before I introduce him a little more formally, and that is first to welcome everyone who did come tonight. I'm delighted to see you here, but also I'd like to recognize Professor Peter Slater, who's in the audience, whom I didn't realize was going to be here, and I'm really delighted to see him. Now, there are several things to say about why it's so wonderful that he's here. I know that tomorrow he's going to be actually talking, I think, with students and probably with faculty if they want to come, and answering some questions about the beginnings of the center, because his father, Robert Slater, was the first director of the Center for the Study of World Religions. Peter himself is a longtime scholar of religions, known throughout North America for his work in religion, and is now emeritus at the University of Toronto. So, Peter, welcome. It's a delight to have you here. Thank you. Frank is now the sixth, I think I have it right, the sixth director of the center. I'm afraid I never knew your father, Peter, but I knew the other five well, and it is really wonderful to have you with us tonight. And I would also welcome members of our Dean's Council who were able to make it tonight and are here. Thank you all for coming and being here as well. Francis X. Clooney. I, again, will not be long with this because most of the people, as I look around this room, know a great deal about Frank and revere him as colleague and as teacher. Frank is a priest and member of the Society of Jesus, as you probably know. He has now been Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology here at HDS since 2005. He's, as I indicated earlier, is now serving as the sixth director of the CSWR across the street since July, and I'm just really delighted about that. I think he's already initiating a number of wonderful new things, and I think we're going to see a really productive period under his leadership. Frank is a Fordham summa cum laude as an undergraduate, and then an MDiv graduate of Western School of Theology in the neighborhood here. But he went off to Chicago to the fine Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations to do his doctorate, which he completed in 1984. He's taught at Boston College, or he taught at Boston College from 1984 until he came to us in 2005. Although he had certainly some visiting sojourns in about 5 other institutions, including this one. He taught for 1 year at Harvard in the mid-90s, and as a visiting professor. And he's also done the same at Chicago while he was at Boston College, and then he spent time also at Oxford, among other places. Frank's scholarship is focused particularly on commentarial writings in the Hindu theological tradition, particularly in South India, but both in Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of literature. So he's a fine linguist and scholar of the Hindu tradition, as well as being what he likes to call a comparative theologian, and I think what most of us would agree he is. This field of comparative theology, which in many ways Frank is now defining, or almost has defined, and is certainly in the process of still refining as well as defining, is distinguished, as he puts it, by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning deepened through study of traditions other than one's own. And this is reflected, I think, most vividly in Frank's teaching, where he is often engaging Hindu texts as a Christian theologian himself, but engaging them theologically. And the students, again and again, that I know who take his classes report that this is an immensely exciting venture, and one that they didn't really, I think in many cases, expect to be getting into when they went to do comparative theology. It's not a matter of holding up 2 traditions, just in looking what's similar and what's different, but it's a matter of sort of taking deeply seriously 2 traditions and trying to see that one can learn in both directions from a deeper knowledge of these traditions. Frank's also written several things, including a couple of books, or edited or written work on the on the tradition, the great tradition of Jesuit missionary work in the Asian world, particularly in India, Robert de Nobly being a particular figure that he is focused on. And he's also very interested in the dynamics of dialogue, religious dialogue in the contemporary world more broadly. I couldn't possibly name as many books and articles. They literally run to about 5 pages. But most recently, the 3 books in the last 2 years that he has turned out are Beyond Compare, St. Francis and Sri Vedanta Deshika on Loving Surrender to God in 2008. And then The Truth, the Way, the Life, Christian Commentary on the 3 Holy Mantras of the Sri Vaishnava Hindus, published in 2008 also. And then he has most recently published as a monograph, Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders, this year, 2010. And he's also edited a volume this year as well on comparative theology, Voices from the Next Generation. He's currently working on what he calls an exercise in dramatic theology, the reading of Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Song of Songs, which many of you will be familiar with, one of the very most famous commentaries, I dare say, in the history of religion. And he's doing this alongside Nam Pillai's commentary on the Tiruvaimali. Am I right, Ann? Am I close on that? Okay, good. I'm a long way from Sanskrit, and this happens to be not Sanskrit, but Tamil, right? And my Tamil is really 0, so, although I learned a little Tamil at one time. In any case, this commentary will be put alongside Bernard of Clairvaux's work, and we look for a very exciting book to come out of that. It focuses on the theme of the absent God in both texts, which is a key theme in these texts and one that Frank will be looking at. I would also just note finally that this summer Frank was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, which is a signal honor, particularly for a Yank, and we're all very proud of that and delighted. All of these things to say that it's really wonderful to have him here tonight and to introduce him. Let me just, before he stands up to talk to us, just mention that Susan Abraham, our colleague, who is now actually our associate director or our managing director at the Center for World Religions, will be responding. And Frank would like to introduce her, and is going to do that after his words to us, and then there will be time for some questions after her response to Frank's talk. So I'm going to turn it over to the 2 of you and let the center have the rest of the evening, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for an introduction that said many of the things I would have said about myself in terms of my work and so on, so you enabled me to move more quickly on my comments. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a busy time of the semester, but I thought as we take up this new era of the center, beginning its second 50 years, that it really is an occasion not so much to celebrate me as director, but rather this new era in the age of the center. And so I appreciate all your coming. And as Bill mentioned, Susan will open a conversation that I hope to some extent you can all participate in, and then come back across the street with us for the reception. So I look forward to our time together. It is somewhat daunting, as Bill has already alluded to be the 6th director of this center. I'm deeply grateful to Don Suera, my immediate predecessor, who for 6 years was a wonderful leader of the center and builder of community, and left the center in such wonderful shape that I could just sort of pick it up and run with it. I'm very grateful to Don, who is in Thailand at the moment. And I'm a longtime friend of John Carman, his predecessor, Larry Sullivan, I have known over the years, both at Chicago and then here at Harvard. And Larry brought a very deep sense of research to the center, its global and intellectual conversation across the disciplines, and I think helped kind of set a very high standard for how we think about the center as an intellectual institution. John Carman, as I was saying, is an old friend. Our fields overlap greatly with South Indian, Tamil studies, and the like. And I think in some ways I find it wonderful to be both in his chair, the Parkman professorship, and also to be director of the center. Like Don, John is out of the country. He's in India. I'm beginning to wonder if the directors have fled to avoid being here tonight. I had the honor of meeting Wilfred Cantwell Smith a few times only. And he was a perfect gentleman, a great scholar, and obviously by all standards and all reports, a wonderful builder of conversations. And I appreciate the heritage of Wilfred Cantwell Smith. That is a strong memory for all of us. And then, as Bill mentioned, Robert Slater, who I also never had the honor of meeting, got the center going and got it off the ground, gave it a sense of direction that I do see really in continuity with where I would want to take the center now. So it is a very long period, 50 years, and the directors of the center leading us thus far that I feel myself obliged to. I must say in passing that I would hope that one of these days, one of the directors of the center would be a woman, perhaps somebody not of the Christian background. I think that would be a wonderful step for Harvard, but that will have to come after me, not with me. As I think of the occasion, I also think of kind of the vision of the founding of the center. It was almost 50 years ago, November 21st, 1960, that Dr. Radhakrishnan, president of India, renowned scholar, Oxford professor, gave the opening lecture on that November 21st day to start the center with a title, The Fellowship of the Spirit. And I won't quote it, but it's a wonderful lecture reflecting on the coming together of India and the West, the role of the university in the understanding of religion, and his excitement in 1960 that colonialism is behind us, the political situation had changed, and the world opened up possibilities for a better understanding of equals across cultural boundaries. And that vision, I think, is still a timely one today. I was also reading in the records, rooting around in the files that we have, the original deed of the center and the vision of the founders, the donors, who made all of this possible. And I'll just read to you one passage, what the donors expected back in the 1950s of the director of the center. The appointment of one person who would be responsible for encouraging the study of the great religions of the world, who would teach and do research in the field of religion, who would relate the work done under this fund with other courses and research programs of the university. The donors hoped that such a person would be able to encourage the cooperative use of all the available resources of the university to make Harvard an outstanding place for the study of the religions of the world. In selecting such a person and others who might work with him or her, the her is my part, academic competence is of course required, but is not considered by the donors to be sufficient in itself. There must also be a dedicated faith and life, and that concern for the spiritual life, which makes a sympathetic and inspiring teacher of religion possible. And I think that vision, too, is timely now as it was 50 years ago. Again, the directors who preceded me, I think, have brought that vision to life in many different ways. But clearly, we are interested, not just the director, but I think all of us in this venture, in expertise, in the study of religion, in crossing religious boundaries, and in being persons who make that come to life concretely. And that vision, I think, is alive today. But even 20 years before that, in 1941, Robert Slater, who would later become the director of the center, also expressed in one of his writings, an exotic book, Guns Through Arcady, about his time in Burma, I believe, gave kind of an earlier vision of the coming together of religious people in an intellectual fashion that I think also he brought to the center in the beginning. I sometimes dream of a university formed by graduates and leaders from all these different Eastern centers, combined with men and women from similar centers in the Christian West, people who would hold hands, not because they hold their faiths lightly, but because they hold them as deeply convinced Muslims, convinced Buddhists, convinced Christians, each loyal to his own tradition, but anxious to understand others. Deriving from their own religious convictions a charity that sees beyond nations, beyond continents to a new world. In such a way, the religions of the world which harness the ideals of such people may serve to advance the greater unity that is already in sight for mankind. Now, 50, 60, 70 years later, we have many hard experiences. We know that it's not so easy to bring these visions about. But I do think we do our work better when we have a sense that things will come together, that crossing of boundaries is possible, that learning from different cultural settings is something that we want to achieve together. And what Robert Slater said in 1941 and the donors said in the late 1950s, I think still can be taken as a goal for us today. And as Bill mentioned also, I have the Jesuit tradition behind me. Some of the first great scholars of religions of India and the East were of the Jesuit order. And I think people like Robert de Nobili bring out something of the same ideal, remarkably, that you need to go, you need to be there, you need to learn, you need to listen, you need to study, and you need to be the kind of person who somehow incorporates in their life some of the values of which you speak. The motivations why we do this may have changed from de Nobili's time until ours now, and yet nonetheless there is a sense, I think, in that Jesuit missionary tradition that you have to be what you teach, you have to be what you research. You have to be in personal contact with those of the other tradition, and if you're unable to do this, really your work begins to fall short. So there's this very long tradition behind me that I bring as I stand here tonight, somewhat daunting, but it's really about the center, and I think the center for me is certainly integrally a part of Harvard Divinity School. I mean, it's a center of the school, it's a center in the school, in a way it's a center for Harvard Divinity School. Harvard Divinity School in the university, and both the university and the center in a world that is in crisis, where religion is seen by many as a solution, but religion also is a cause of great trouble. And I think we cannot back away or blind ourselves and say we're just doing academic work or we're just studying here in kind of a vacuum in 2010. But the center in the Divinity School, in the university, in a world of great suffering, we really have to be thinking through what is the public role of religion, what is the public role of people like ourselves as we look forward. And I think the center cannot do any of that by itself. It has, it really is a place to bring all of us together, but nonetheless has that public responsibility. And as Robert Slater said in 1941 in The Donors in the 50s, how to do that in a way that does not flee from the spiritual dimensions of these possibilities. How to, again, be the kind of people who live these things out in their lives and in their vision. So the center I see as a kind of crossroads, a center, a kind of centering moment in the life of the school and the university by which we can overcome some of these boundaries and begin to find ourselves coming together. Now all of this is a long history and it's a very wide horizon if we think of all the possible connections of the world around us. And yet I think of myself in this position, the first thought I have is, what am I doing up here? I could think of 10 other people perhaps who would have been better suited to be in the position I find myself. And I think one of the things I'd like to say to you in the title of the tension of my talk between the particularities and why they matter is that in some way, if I think about my gift or my ability such as it is, there's a way in which it is narrow and particular, and yet it opens up a possibility for me, and I'd like to think that each of us around the room can in some way share in this same dynamic. We do particular things that we care about, and in opening up those particularities, we do something that all of us can learn from and that can matter to the wider world around us. There are various ways I could put my experience, and one way might be more autobiographical in terms of going to India for the first time right after college and going back any number of times after that, living there, teaching, having friendships that go back now 35, 40 years almost. A long kind of tradition of loving India and loving the people of India and Nepal both. But I think, as Bill was alluding to, really what I have dedicated myself to all these years, even in recent decades when I go to India, is really the close study of the text. And while there are many, many ways to learn religiously and interreligiously, I think one of the key factors and key elements that for me comes to the fore is that we can sit and read, and sitting and reading is an intellectual and spiritual practice of great power. And while some people learn by conversation, some people learn by going places, some people learn by collaborative projects, I've always found that when really it comes to the base for me, it's kind of this inward-looking reflection on the text. And that by reading texts of the Tamil tradition, the Sanskrit tradition, by reading parallels in Greek and Latin literature, for instance, in some way there's a kind of dynamic and a chemistry opened up that goes very deep. And by reflecting deeply inside it, things come to the fore that then I can share with other people. So the project that I am working on at the moment, tentatively titled A God Real Enough to Be Absent, is really my way of pondering an issue that I think concerns many of us and can be legitimately approached in many different ways, where we look around us and say there is a great sense today, not only of kind of debate in the media or debate in intellectual circles about what does the word God mean, or how can there be any proof of the existence of God, or do we know what we're talking about when we use the word God? But also at some deeper level, the sense that we probably are not going to be in the position where we can make these judgments. That at some level it becomes very, very elusive. We realize in light of religious diversity, in light of the manifold understandings of what the word God could mean in different religious and cultural context, or goddess by analogy, that debating it pro and con in theistic or atheistic terms is not going to resolve things. Doing history of the term, doing history of how people have used the term is not really enough either. And I think my particular contribution, and the reason I'm pointing to it is because it's very particular, it's really mine, and I wouldn't recommend that this be the only way we look at these things, is that taking as a premise of a certain sort that God is real, and that God does exist, and that God does matter, but that God is not a predictable being such as we might expect to see all the time, and that God is a vividly real being who can come and go, who can be present at very intense moments, but also can be entirely absent from our lives, either for short periods or long periods of time. And that God is not someone that we can sort of judge to exist and then have handy in case we need God, but that God comes and goes like the lover in the night, who cannot be relied upon, who cannot be predicted, who cannot be held on to and said, stay. And this kind of intuition that while these debates are large and there are many, many different ways of thinking about them, my contribution is to go back into the text. And this certainly will not capture all the media headlines, I'm sure. But by going back and studying, on the one side, the Song of Songs, reading the biblical text over and again, trying to understand the poetry, the forms of the poetry, the ways in which this text was put together, but also reading it, as Bill alluded to, with one great medieval Christian tradition of commentary. So Bernard of Clairvaux, Gilbert of Hoyland, John of Ford, who over some 200 plus sermons finally went through the 8 chapters of the song. It's a marvelous kind of conversation that crosses many, many boundaries of language and history and religion, to see what they did in trying both as faithful Christian interpreters, writing in a theological context that is recognizable, but also without doing damage to the poetry of saying, okay, we know in some ways who God is, we know what our tradition says about God, and yet clearly this poetry is talking about she is in love with a lover who is not there half the time. When he is intensely present, then suddenly he is gone. And both Bernard and Gilbert and John, in their own ways, reflect on this fact that the most powerful, intense moments of the presence of God are small and slight, and they pass away. And that while one can spend one's entire life kind of on a contemplative path, going deep into kind of monastic contemplation, meditation, reading, study, that does not guarantee that God becomes something familiar that one can hold on to. Because the same God who was there intensely for you could be gone for a very long time thereafter. So I've been very fascinated by this and studying it and thinking about it deeply. But because of the nature of the work I do, it's also a matter of, in a sense, saying that's not enough today. It may be enough for some scholars or some believers in their tradition, but by parallel, going into the South Indian tradition of similar poetry, poetry of a very intensely present God, Vishnu, Narayana, in the Tamil Vaishnava tradition, and finding in the poetry of poets like Namalvar and parallel poets, a very strong sense that the experience of God can be put in terms of the relationship of him and her, she and he. And very much in the similar terms in this poetry, there are these moments of incredible intensity and incredible close-up, vivid contact where the two lovers are inside one another, apparently in a very literal fashion. And yet, immediately at the same time thereafter, he is gone, she is alone in the night, she does not know if he's coming back, she knows that he's somewhere else and she cannot reach him. And the sense both of kind of the problem of the distance, which then is intensified and made worse by the fact that they had been so intensely together before that. And in some ways, one could write books about how this is not the same tradition, not the same problematic, not the same style of commentary as that of Bernard and his successors. and that the song is not the same as the South Indian poetry of the love of God. Nonetheless, I've found it fruitful over the years to begin always to read these things together, not proving that one is the same as the other, but that if I begin, in a certain sense, in the Christian tradition with the Song of Songs, in a certain sense, part of my heritage, learning from that and the dramatic possibilities, the aesthetics, the poetry of this tradition, and then reading it through the tradition of South India, it begins to open up for me the possibilities of what exactly are we talking about, and how does this mean, and how does it feel when we say that God is present or absent. And while the solution to our problems in 2010 or 2020 or thereafter are not going to be in terms of saying to the skeptics, well, if you read the Song of Songs, you'll get your answer, or if you read Bernard of Clairvaux, you'll know that God exists, but rather that the problematic that people are putting forward, there is no God, God is not evident, science does not need God, can also be reimagined in terms of very ancient possibilities of poetry, drama, the imagination in religious traditions, where theology did not prevent people from thinking that the God we know, the God who has touched our lives, is also a God who is absent. And while part of my proclivity, my desire really in doing this work, is to simply go deeper and deeper into these traditions and sort of to disappear into my office and never be seen again. A part of me also is more, you might say, disruptive than that, because these traditions are, in a sense, not meant to be read together. And that if you are in the world of Bernard of Clairvaux or Numpillai in South India, our tradition is adequate, our story is adequate, our vision of God is adequate. And I think by what I'm doing, my way of kind of valiantly trying to actually live in the present, is to read across these traditional boundaries and to realize that we probably are beyond the age where living and knowing one's own tradition is enough. And I think if we go back and again read Robert Slater and his successors, Wilfred Cantwell Smith and others at the center, if we really think about how religion has been practiced here at Harvard Divinity School and at the center, we know this on other levels, that our knowing our own tradition is not enough, as is famously said. And yet really what I see my work is doing is trying to disrupt the ways we think about this, the way we write prose about it, the way we systematize it, by insisting that two traditions that have never been told as the same story figure in my work and figure in what I care about. And by doing this, on one level, and particularly at the moment, it becomes very bewildering, in the sense that, you know, where exactly is this project going? How will this book come out that I'm writing? But I think that's necessarily part of the project, that if we talk about the absence of God, or if we talk about learning across boundaries in unpredictable ways, and say, but I'm totally in control, I know exactly how this is going to turn out, we're probably missing something. And while if 2 years from now I'm saying I'm still clueless about this project and I have no idea where it's going, I might begin to worry by then. At the moment, I think it's good that I'm kind of struggling to find the images, the words, the rhythms by which to speak across these boundaries. And I really do believe that then the struggle is to take this research, which I care about in its particularity. You know, reading these commentaries, you can endlessly delve into them and say, it's not enough for me to read this one and that one and the two of them together, but to share it with others who have not actually been reading them. And while this seems like an obvious issue, and we run into this in teaching all the time, I think it's a very profound issue, that the things we care about most as scholars and the things we do most in our study are often the things that are hardest to share with others. And the temptation is to retreat to theory, or to retreat to some kind of secondary discourse about the study of religion. But I think there are other ways of beginning to figure out how to draw readers in to share the problematic, not simply by saying, as we well can, go and read Bernard of Clairvaux, go and read Numpillai, go and read the Song of Songs and the Hindu parallels, but also by ourselves writing in a way that opens the problematic, that stirs up the imagination, that gives people a sense, what would it mean to be searching for God in one's tradition and outside that tradition? And how do we write this up? And I think in some ways, it's a matter of questions of method, of language, of prose and poetry, how the aesthetic and dramatic element figures into our writing on religion. But I also think, and this is my personal thing, that constructively it also advances our understanding of what it means to say that there is a God, or that God can be present in 2010. And all of this for me comes together. And I think part of my point, though, is to realize that it's my problem, my dynamic, my research, but hopefully opens up into areas that we can talk about across the boundaries of our fields of research. In general, I think, for instance, to generalize some of the issues that I'm struggling with, I'll just read through some of the dichotomies that I find both necessary to respect as I do a project such as the one I'm working on, but also to not respect and to say that these are not final. Theory and practice, the subjective and the objective, the insider and the outsider perspectives, prose and poetry, the oral and the written, the particular and the universal, the center, the central, and the marginal, what is heard, what is suppressed and ignored, what is given word, what is left in silence, the study of religions, the study of theology, academic conversation, interreligious conversation, the center, the school, the university. I think any of these distinctions, and we could go on for hours, I suppose, on any of them, need to be respected, that these things are not all the same, and we do not do a service to ourselves, our colleagues, our students, by mixing everything together. But I think my sense is, out of my particular research, is that any of those boundaries that I just mentioned really are in themselves no longer stable. And that by setting up distinctions between insider, outsider, objective, subjective, my tradition, your tradition, we immediately then can see them as borders to be crossed. And that somehow what we do at the center, what we do at the school, what we do in the university is precisely to honor, notice, and then problematize those very boundaries. So I've been talking a lot about me and what I do. In the next part of my reflections here, I'd like to just really, by analogy, say my hope and my belief is that what I'm saying about myself is in some way true of you in the writing, the research, the thinking about religion, the exploring of religious topics that you also are engaged in. Because I know in many ways, and this is my 6th year here at the Divinity School, that so many of us are passionately concerned about the research we're involved in. If it's not South Indian poetry or if it's not the Song of Songs, by analogy, so many of us, both faculty and students, spend our time deep in what we care about. And I just listed some of these. Continuing research in established fields, ranging from scripture to history to ethics to theology. Deep studies within particular religious traditions, within their particular locations in one or another culture. Seeing religions in their locales, but also imagining religions outside their starting places and imagining them across boundaries in a global context. Allowing the traditional discourses of our study to be problematized and questioned in terms of gender, race, postmodern, postcolonial critiques. Insisting that while we need to do work according to our disciplinary traditions, we also need to question and upset those boundaries so that voices from the margins can be held. We also know that we write in prose, we publish in prose, and yet we know very well that reading and writing text is not enough. There is field work. There's the anthropologist doing his work by visiting and being in places and work that cannot be replaced. There is poetry, there's the imagination, there are the arts. All of these things, by knowing you over the past 5 years, I know that you care deeply about one or another of these things, and that this too matters to you in the way I was talking about myself and what I work on. And I also think of the younger members of our audience today, that some of you, even as I'm talking, you're thinking about how you would say these things differently, how the problematic of your generation is different from mine. And I think that's exciting, that just as I look back to Robert Slater and Wilfred Cantwell Smith and the figures who preceded me, I'm also looking forward, or want to look forward, and to say if you're in graduate school now or thinking of graduate school, then that exactly is to allow you to trace a new path and to imagine how these fields will develop differently. But I'd like to suggest in this process that you share my problem. And that my problem for myself is very particular research that you wouldn't have guessed that working on the Song of Songs and South Indian parallels is the credential by which you become the director of the center. Likewise, I think that many of us, maybe all of us in this room, have deeply considered lifelong commitments to certain areas of research, certain topics that lead to certain kinds of teaching, certain kinds of writing, fields that you're excited about and you know very well you can share them with only a few people. Very few people actually know the details of what you do, as I find for myself in what I do. And that in some way, you, I believe, if I can speak in very general terms, also want to communicate that and find ways of sharing what you care about most deeply in your research with those around you. And I think what we have in common is not that your research or your intellectual questions or your traditional location is going to be the same as mine, and that's what we have in common, because that's not possible. But rather that the problematic that I have is the problematic that you have. And that looking across these boundaries and saying not so much can we come up with kind of a generic discourse of the study of religion that will fit all of us, or that we can do theology in a certain way that explains what everybody does before they do it, but rather to say that out of the intensity of what I care about and what you care about, we can find ways to have the conversation. And that the exciting thing about the center as part of Harvard Divinity School at Harvard University is that we have the people and the resources in this place to make this conversation possible, to cross these boundaries. And I think that sense that we care about what we do, we love it, we want to share it, and in many ways we're all frustrated because we find that very hard to do, is a reason for having a Center for the Study of World Religions in 2010. That the point is that the center, again, is a center, a place for centering. It's a luxury and a resource for which we must be eternally grateful to the donors back in the 50s to give Harvard Divinity School a very distinctive resource, a very great possibility that in the midst of all the things we do and all the projects and all the disciplines and all the teaching, all the things that concern us, we also have this oasis across the street in which we can find ways to calm down, allow ourselves to enjoy and then share our research and see where the points come together. So the image of the center, centering, but also the center is a kind of crossroads where all of us from our different backgrounds and traditions and disciplines can meet. Again, not saying you can come across the street if you agree with the following things, but rather if you care about what you're doing, if you have an intellectual agenda, if you're devoting your life to certain kinds of ideas and struggling with the methods and looking for the words and making it personal, then indeed the center is a great resource for all of us in which we do this. Now, what are we doing at the center? This will be my anxiety for the next 4 years. All the previous directors did wonderful things in their terms of office. What did Clooney do in his 4 years? Nothing much. That's my fear. It's easy fear now because I haven't had time yet. It's only 100 days, as they say. But 4 years from now, what will people say? And I think, well, I've used the common term in talking to people of a grassroots year, that this is the year for going slow, and this is the year for thinking from where we are, rather than trying to impose kind of a meta structure or a big program of some sort. In some ways, I really deeply believe that it is from the ground, it's from the earth, it's from the things we care about that the center will succeed. So again, I'll give you just a list, a laundry list, and of these things that maybe make some sense, even just hearing them. Allowing the doctoral students of religion, the THD and PhD, to come to the center for the intriguingly titled Academic Casual, to meet with one another, usually without professors being present, to talk across their disciplinary boundaries, to talk about what's going on in their field for their generation now, and to meet like once a month and to talk across those boundaries. I think it's a wonderful thing. Inaugurating a series of MTS MDiv lunches at the center in order to simply, as we've very much enjoyed, I think under Don Swearer's leadership, faculty lunches at the center to provide an oasis. We can't have all MTS MDiv students together at once in the center. It's not that big. But nonetheless, creating a space where at least once a month, MTS MDiv students can come together to talk about issues of common concern. Advertisement, the next lunch is on Monday, this coming Monday, to talk about this talk. It's one that has a title and a topic, and there's a sign-up sheet. There'll be one at the reception. But basically to create a context, and then after this one, which has a title, in the future to say, all right, what do you who come and share this meal want to talk about? from your MTS and MDiv program perspectives. I think that's a good thing. Continuing conversations with the staff of Harvard Divinity School about how important they are to the school and, in my vision, to the center. That people who work in the library, people who work in development, people who work in human resources, people who clean the buildings, all the people here are not sort of invisible people around the edges, but often work at Harvard Divinity School with great experience, with great care for the institution, and to figure out ways in which the center is for all of us, and ways in which both the center can be of value to people who work here on the staff, but also that people on the staff can share their wisdom with us, all of us who else are here, professors and students and the like, how to bring that about. Having occasional series. We had a wonderful session yesterday with Pamela Greenberg about her new translation of the Psalms and talking about Hebrew poetry and English renderings and issues related to how do you take poetry in any language and put it in another, but also how do you take a sacred scriptural text and render it both in fidelity to the original revelation, the original tradition, but also make sense of it in 2010. I'd love to have more such. I'd love to have a translation series where we talk about how we translate, because so many of us are doing this. We're talking at the center about a cross-cultural film series. Several of the residents are very interested in this, and probably there will be in the spring start to show some films from different parts of the world that have both cultural and religious themes that work well together. Working with the Committee in Study of Religion, Professor Diana Eck, and her helpers, Tamsin Jones, Professor Jones, and others over in the Barker Center, to reach out to the undergraduate concentrators and to say, well, the center is clearly part of Harvard Divinity School and it's sort of over here at the edge of the university. The service of the center to the college and to the undergraduates, who even younger than the grad students, are also imagining a future for the study of religion, how to bring them to the center and have conversations that help them, if they're sophomores, juniors, seniors, in their work. What to do with the building itself. We have this lovely building. I hope you can come to the reception afterwards. We have a wonderful staff. Charles Anderson, Rebecca Esterson are here tonight that make this a home. Alicia Belair is here, I see also. Wonderful center for sharing and making it a welcome space. There's a lovely garden. And sort of saying, well, this is a resource for all of us, and it's not a trivial thing to say we have a place, because we need places. We need welcoming spaces. We need a place where you can sit at the table. Some people have said under Clooney, the center will mainly feed people. And I think that, if that's all I did, that might be weird. But in some ways, that's a good thing. Hospitality, the food and the drink that enable us as human beings to be together is very important. The wonderful residential community. There are some 20-some people living at the center this year, and that's an incredible resource. It's a rare thing in 2010 to have housing so integral to a department or a school of the university. And yet to say we have not simply they're renting rooms at the center, but they are integral to the life of the center. Their perspectives, their work, their initiatives that are all popping up now in terms of all different fields makes the center much more than I could make it, or the staff could make it, or we could do as faculty, is to say this is a place that is lived in, and the living community in the place makes it much more than it could be. Or even the meditation room. We have a meditation room that I hope you visit or see as you step into the building. People said symbolically I took the director's office and turned it into an empty room when I became director. It's a gamble. Is there space at Harvard Divinity School for meditation? Everybody's telling me, oh, it's a wonderful idea, and so glad you have this meditation room. I just don't have time. I'd love to visit it. I have no time for meditation. I have no time to sit down. It's a work in progress, and I think we need to see. But I thought one of the symbolic things I would like to provide as director of the center is that empty space, a space that is not programmed, a space that is not a meeting space, a space that is not for this or that, but anybody can go into that space, sit there in silence, pray, meditate, take a nap, whatever is necessary at the moment, and see how that goes. And that's a gift to the school and to the university, I hope, that we have this space. Discussions of intellectual projects. At the end of the month, I think November 29th, we'll have the first of an occasional series of book conversations. Our Dean Bill Graham's book, Islam and the Comparative Study, Religious Studies. We're going to have a conversation around a new book, and I'd love to have, as new books come out from our colleagues, discussions of the books, bring in experts from the university, maybe around the country, to discuss the work that is in progress. Faculty colloquia. We have 2 of them going at the moment, one in comparative studies, one on the material bodies of deities, that bring together with great energy a number of faculty and doctoral students. And I think, again, we care about the particularities of what we do, and yet often the hardest thing is finding other people who care about them in a similar enough way that we could sit down and talk together. And I think if one of the things the center does in my years is provide the space where people can talk across nearby boundaries about the work they do, this will be a very good thing, and I will go away happy in 4 years. And so on. So those are some of the things, and none of them are dramatic, none of them are large, none of them kind of claim the attention of the world about what Clooney thinks about the study of religion. But I think, for me, these are the necessary steps, that just in my research, I don't say I have a theme and I will pick out texts that prove the theme. I don't say the center will be what I mandate it to be, but we talk, we share, we communicate with one another, and we make something happen, and that is the project for the next few years. But what is underlying this? I mean, what is this about? And this is my last point, really. What are we talking about? Isn't there any content to my vision of the center? And I picked up just, I think it's 6 points that I would personally hold and personally want to argue as we go forward, and then see where they overlap with your concerns or your points. What would you say if you're standing up here about the 6 points that you want to put forward that we can share? And I'll just go through them very briefly. Retrieving an importance of tradition in a postmodern age that is so fluid. So bringing tradition back, understanding tradition. What does it mean to belong to a tradition? Why do we care about traditions? What happens if we are detached from the traditions of our own or various religions? What if tradition has become a problem? How do we make tradition, belonging to tradition, mean something in our fluid, hybrid world? The study of the text and other ways of learning. As you know from the start, I mean, I basically read texts. I read. But that's one thing. Other media, other ways of learning, not only field work, but visual media, oral media, conversations. How do we both preserve the fact that once in a while you should just sit down and read something, but on the other hand, open it up and say there are many, many other ways to experience lived religion and to live out the possibilities of what we study. The dynamics, the politics, the possibilities of translation. I think we're translating all the time. I'm translating what's in my head now to talk to you. But in some ways, I think we translate text. We translate the details of our particular disciplines and try to open them up to people who have never shared in those details. We worry about terms from Christianity. Can they in some ways serve if we're studying Buddhism or Hinduism? Or we take words from Sanskrit or Chinese and worry about, can those words be put into English so that they matter in larger conversations about religion? Can we change the way we study by religion by somehow rendering in English the discourses of African or Native American traditions, and so on? And I think translation is an exciting issue for us to think about. The responsibilities of the professor, the intellectual, in a world of suffering and violence. And I have not talked much about this, but I think if we have any eyes or any ears, we know from reading the newspapers that there's enormous suffering, I mean, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our country, around the world. And while in some ways our duty is to do the things we're doing here, I think if we're not hard-hearted or narrow-minded or blinded by our own importance, somehow we have to have openings in those directions and really ask ourselves, what is the public role of the Harvard professor? What is the public role of the Center for the Study of World Religions in 2010? And how will it help people who really need our help? And I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer those questions, but I'd love to be in conversation about it. A retrieval, just as we retrieve tradition, a retrieval of theology, understood constructively and interreligiously as a key, not the only key, but as a key to the future of Harvard's thinking about religion. And while there are some, I think, who would say, well, all right, theology is the past, and theology is what they used to do, and we need another model for the study of religion, and we do need other models for the study of religion, and many of those are already flourishing in the school and the university. I personally believe that theology, with its deeper commitments, with its concern for truth, with its concern for the overflow from theory to practice, and the boundaries that it sets where some things are true and some things are false is absolutely necessary. And we can't just do it by saying, well, Catholic theology is the answer, or Sri Vaishnava theology is the answer, but in some way of not saying our solution to the thinking about religion at Harvard excludes constructive theology. And that is of great interest to me. And then finally for me, and maybe for some of you, as I started with my research project, the rediscovery of what it means to talk about God today. How do we think about God? How do we talk about God? How does God make sense? And 1,000 things can be said about that word and how it means different things for different people, and we need to respect people's space, both intellectually and personally, of not intruding inappropriately. But nonetheless, this is my starting point, that I really do think we need to be able to talk more vigorously about God in the modern university. And I'd like to think that if I have those 6 points, you have other points, and that my 6 points are not so much, establishing boundaries around the center. Here's the barbed wire fence around the center. The cost of entry is to take up one of Clooney's points. But rather, these are borders that I've been kind enough to kind of identify, and I hope you transgress them, that you cross them, that you imagine other alternatives, that you add to my list of 6, your list of 6, and that we actually have things we can care enough about that we get heated or we feel uncomfortable in each other's presence in the course of talking these through and eating them through at the center. I'd like to finish my part here before turning things over to my colleague by reading you a text that fortunately, providentially perhaps, or just by chance, is the passage that's going to be read at the morning Eucharist, 8:30 tomorrow, up in Andover Chapel. Once a month we have a Catholic Mass, the roll of the dice meant I have the Catholic Mass tomorrow. But it's a passage that for me indicates, in a very Christian perspective obviously, but the whole problematic of my talk, the particular and the universal, and how getting very, very particular in a way that others might not imagine getting us anywhere can open up the most kind of comprehensive and universal perspective. This is a passage from the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 3. For this reason I bow before God, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. I pray that according to the abundance of divine glory, God may grant us to be made strong in our inner persons by the power of Spirit, that Christ may dwell in our hearts through faith, that we be rooted and grounded in love, that we may have the power to see with all the saints what is the breadth and length, the height and depth, and to know the love of God surpassing all knowledge, that we may be filled entirely with the fullness of God. Again, I would invite you, if you were standing up here, what would be some other text that you might see? It's particular and universal at the same time. But for me, that vision of it's Jesus of Nazareth and it's the entire universe, in some ways on a very personal level, gets at me at the kind of thing I think I can bring to the center in these years. But thank you. One of the very good things I've been able to do in my first 100 days, and not without cost, because nothing is easy in this world, has been to create a space at the center for having a managing director, an associate director of the center, a colleague and friend with whom I can work closely in thinking things through, again, with the staff and with our managing director, Professor Susan Abraham. And I'd like to turn things over to her, but tell you about her first. Susan Abraham, Managing Director of the Center, is also Assistant Professor of Women's Studies and Ministry here at the Divinity School. She's been here since 2007. Her early studies were at Sophia College for Women in Mumbai. She did a MA in Theology at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and her THD was from Harvard Divinity School not so long ago, 2003. She was, before coming back to Harvard in 2007, an associate professor of theology at St. Bonaventure University in New York. Her teaching and research explore post-colonial and feminist theological practices, invigorating contemporary communities of faith. Her publications and presentations weave together practical theological insights from her own experiences working in Mumbai with youth, but also the theoretical perspectives of post-colonial theory, cultural studies, and feminist theories. Among her many writings, Her book in 2007 was Identity, Ethics, and Nonviolence in Postcolonial Theory, a Rainerian Theological Assessment. She also published an anthology in 2009, Shoulder to Shoulder, Frontiers in Catholic Feminist Theology. Her ongoing research projects include feminist theological education and formation, interfaith and interreligious peace initiatives, theology and political theory, religion and media, global Christianities, and Christianity between colonialism and post-colonialism. She's also working currently on a book, Space, Time, and Law, Post-Colonial Feminist Perspectives on Religion and Nationalism. So let us welcome Susan Abraham.
Thank you very much. I want to respond with a question. And my question is this: what does a Jesuit and a post-colonial feminist have in common? Sounds like the first sentence of a poor joke. And maybe a poor joke, I don't know. I think it would have been easier to do what does a post-colonial feminist and a Jesuit, how are we different? And I think that's obvious. And that's why I'm in costume today, too. The more difficult thing is to find a way to speak about our commonalities. And in some ways, because of my relationship with Frank, and in some ways I've been formed by his thinking and our friendship, it wasn't that hard either. There are three ways in which we are common. And I will start with the first one. We share a common vision with regard to the academic project. But in so doing, we are savage. So the thing that's common between us is that we are savage. We are academics who are savage. I use the word savage as a description of post-colonial theory by a contemporary theorist called Ali Bedad. It is savage, he says, when you use post-coloniality to think interdisciplinarily, counter-systematically, and in contestatory ways. It is wild, defiant, and radically political. Academic practice for me has to be political activity. We cannot anymore, I don't think, and this is why, again, I am in costume in a certain way, we cannot depend on our old certitudes. We cannot depend in the old ways in which we were sure of the way we produce knowledge, in the ways we were sure of our knowledge. Our knowledge now must have a savage nature to it. And in a way, it's funny to think. So the Jesuits came a long time ago to India to encounter the savage, and then we turned around and made them savage. And I think that's a good way to think about post-coloniality. Being savage helps us to rethink the relationships between ideology, history, culture, theory, and knowledge. Now, how do we get there? Professor Clooney has already mentioned that one of his methods of doing this kind of thinking is to read slowly. It is only when one reads slowly that the possibility of critical interventions, this unsettling that he talked about, you become aware of how the text can and ought to unsettle. Reading thus, reading slowly, breaches the barricades between disciplines, religious traditions, and cultural contexts. Being savage means that one is not corralled. Corralled? I don't know. My English escapes me. Corralled by disciplinary boundaries. One of the ways in which I think we both are disruptive is to be savage about space. So there is an empty space, Frank said, at the center, an empty space that awaits you to infuse it with meaning. There are other spaces in the way we talk, in the way we present our relationship to spaces. I belong to the space that is in a very complicated way called India. I rarely claim that space. To me, that space is more fiction, an act of the imagination, and constantly escaping even my understanding, constantly. Again, the funny thing is, the more it escapes me, the better he understands it. There are days I wish I could get into his brain to understand India. And he always looks at me and says, I don't know what you're talking about. I wish I could be Indian. Well, I am Indian, but I still do not know how to relate to that space. To me, that space is too full. I like empty spaces. So to be savage is to do something with space. It is also to do something with time. Why are we messing around with 12th century medieval Tamil texts in the 21st century? What does that do to us? What does it do to our imaginations? I think it confounds a certain narrative grasp of time, what post-colonial theorists called the allochronic, powerful narrative of time. We love inventing words, you see. It's what you do with English. You turn around and use it or abuse it. Both space and time become disruptive. And that, I would think, is our savage academic activity that we engage in. We have some interesting conversations in this regard. And very often, I'm caught by Frank's Indian question to me. And I would think once in a while, he's caught by my very Catholic response back to him. And this is the kind of synergy that I am very privileged to experience. We also share a common political project. Frank talked about today, right now, he talked about the possibility of not doing religion in a vacuum. There is a public role, he said. Religious people and intellectuals who engage in the study of religion must occupy. But in order to do so, we cannot escape into a no place. We have to dwell in our particularities. To dwell in particularity means to make commitments. And for people who do the kind of comparative, cross-cultural, cross-temporal investigative work that Frank does, and I do to an extent, is to engage in translations. Now, translation is a very complicated, problematic, and bewildering activity. Nothing translates well. Post-colonial theorists like to say it does. If you think about the politics of translation, it can be encapsulated in this one sentence. We're also good at one-sentence questions, actually. So here's the one-sentence question with regard to translation. What does it mean to be a post-colonial reader, thinker, and speaker of English in the 20th century? Immediately the weight, the cultural weight of a rather immediate colonial history. Colonialism is not that new, it's an old phenomenon, but in this version, the weight of that cultural history is borne by this one language. What does it mean for us to create knowledge solely in this one discourse, this one language? This, to us post-colonials, is a complex question. As an Indian, I know I am glad I speak English, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be here. It would have been difficult. What to do with translation? Translation is not simply using the skills of grammar and vocabulary. It requires, in the way one is a post-colonial, to adopt a deliberately political stance. I would say that is the only way to do what Professor Clooney said we need to do with our work, with our intellectual and spiritual work, to alleviate the sufferings, to alleviate and address the sufferings of the world. One needs to translate not just with grammar, not just with vocabulary, not just with the base structure of the language, but with the political implications being grasped in some way. For a feminist translator, the work is a little bit more fraught. One realizes as a feminist translator that language operates already in a rhetorical context. It reveals gendered agency. How does a feminist translator translate gendered agency? Not only that, she must be doubly, triply, and sometimes quadruply aware that she cannot perpetuate through her translations race, class, gender, or sexuality privileges. She has to be aware and be careful and attempt, in as much as she can, in order to alleviate and address the sufferings of the world, not to perpetuate this. Spivak, who I ventriloquize most of the time, will argue, without a sense, she says, quote, without a sense of the rhetoricity of language, the embeddedness of language, any translation becomes a species of neocolonialist construction. And it's a neocolonialist construction of the non-West. So imagine that, an academic activity to alleviate suffering, to address suffering, that attempts in every way not to repeat these patterns of domination. We also share a common theological project. I think one of the best things that, for me, being here at Harvard sometimes, where the grammar of theology, which is what I hold on to, I'm not institutionally a Catholic, I don't think I am, but I am in my language, in my imagination, in the way I think grammatically about religion, I am a theologian. And we share a common theological project. And I find, working with Frank, that this grammar is what is most useful and interesting to share between us. What kind of grammar would alleviate, or what kind of grammar would one deploy in this context? Most of you probably know this. On October 17th, Chancellor Angela Merkel announced the complete failure of multiculturalism. This is what she said. In the beginning of the 60s, our country called the foreign workers to come to Germany, and now they live in the country. We kidded ourselves a while. We said, they won't stay, sometime they'll be gone. But this isn't a reality. And of course, the approach to build a multicultural society, multiculti, they call it, to live side by side with each other and to enjoy each other has failed, utterly failed. She goes on to say, we feel bound to the Christian image of humanity. That is what defines us. Those who do not accept this are in the wrong place here. Germans, she says, Germans should also talk about their values and their increasing alienation from religion in order to affirm their sense of country and society. Here we have a problem. If particularity becomes particular in this way, then what happens to universality? Can Frank and I have a conversation then about this particular grammar, a Christian grammar to which we are both committed, when it gets attached to statements about a common life in this way? Where and how does it break down? In my work, one of the things that I want to do, and one of the ways in which I hope conversations at the center can be carried on, is to look at how religious grammars get attached to grammars of nation building. The nation space for a number of post-colonial theorists is simply an alibi for colonialism. How to celebrate particularity when what we call into question is nation and national identity? For Spivak, for example, she says, the most horrifying thing she can imagine is a Hindu India and a Christian America. What happens to religious grammars when it gets unproblematically attached to spaces and to times? Because nation is an imagination of this time. And can our conversations, theological, multi-religious, intercultural, between very different sources of power and agency, can we begin to confound, bewilder, transgress these very problematic ways of, I think, sabotaging the way we live with each other? A core principle of Catholic theology, something I always threatened my intro to Catholic theology students with, is if I come to your bedroom at 3 in the morning and I wake you up with a loud scream, and you wake up with your heart in your mouth thinking, who is this crazy mad woman? And I say, what is the most important principle of Catholic theology? You better say sacramentality. And they always give me that look, like, oh. But it's interesting to think about. One should. One doesn't do this, and that is, I think, the failure of Catholic theology. At the heart of Catholic theology, but here is also the strange thing, it is at the heart of all religious imaginations. At the heart of Catholic theology is an idea that Frank and we would like to put into action. And the idea is that of sacramentality. What is sacramentality? It is a simple principle that argues that in every created reality, in the human and in the more than human, is the presence of something that is beyond our grasp. Post-colonial theorists call it transcendence. We are scholars and students of religion and theology. We name that transcendence. That sacramentality that infuses this embodied reality has to be at the heart of our programs for thinking community, for thinking study, for thinking scholarship. In this way, we hope, I hope, and I have great hopes for these 4 years. So every time he does this thing, I don't know what they'll say 4 years from now, I'll say, don't do that. We will have to enact sacramentality. One of the ways we do this well is through, I think, our ministry, to use another problematic Catholic word or Christian word, our ministry of hospitality. Now, hospitality is like, to use a Boltonian metaphor here, hospitality is that, HTP people will know this, it's like the snake you pick up. If you pick it up in the wrong way, it will bite you. Hospitality can be ridiculously benevolent. It can be an act of imperial benevolence to be hospitable. How to be hospitable to generate sacramentality? That requires humility. That requires empty spaces. That requires a non-attachment to time. I hope to see all of you often with us. I hope in these 4 years, we will make sure that Clooney doesn't have to be responsible for life at the center. Thank you very much.
we have, I think if all goes well, we've sort of put out tonight many of the ideas we'd like to talk with you about over the next 4 years. So we need not tarry for too long in this room. But before heading across the street for reception, I hope you can stay. I thought maybe 10, 15 minutes, if anyone would like to share your wisdom on the center or the possibilities of the next few years. And then we will stop and head across the street and then hope for further conversations as time goes on. So, Kevin.
Frank, thank you, Susan, for those remarks. I was hoping not to use a microphone in the event that, in the likely event that my question is embarrassing, and that everybody would then hear it. My question is this, Frank, in your very rich reflections on your 6th point regarding respect for other traditions, and this is a question to a capacious Irish Catholic soul and heart and mind from one who is the opposite, except Irish Catholic, and a medievalist, and therefore intolerant and inquisitorial and all those bad things. But it's my question is, if I can lapse into serious mode here for a moment, this, or something like this, is there a moment, do you think, and is there a place in the center for a moment in which, I won't say we disrespect other traditions, but in which we wonder about them, hesitate over them, or particular historical moments of them? One of our colleagues in this room once wrote an article with the fine interrogative title, "Must we always accept the other's self-understanding?" And I'm wondering how you might respond to that question and to the question, is there room for that sort of question in the center, and how you might think about that?
I think I've spent most of my career trying to persuade people like me that learning from the other is possible and they shouldn't feel threatened by it, and they'll learn many things that they'll enjoy and do it. So this is my BC years and somewhere like that. So I've always been kind of on that end of the spectrum in terms of comparative study. You can do this, we can learn, we can understand each other. But I've also always held in principle that we really gain a level of mutual respect that is serious and a level of trust that actually works in practice if we can have serious disagreements with one another. And I find that very hard. I mean, when I go to India, I will, have discussions with Sri Vaishnava Hindus in Madras and so on like that. And often we disagree, but it's because we don't understand each other. I'm also, I think, what you're pointing to is a higher ideal where, okay, now I really do understand how you see what's going on in your tradition. I really understand what you mean by this text. And I just don't agree, either because it really doesn't reconcile with my faith perspective, or I find it in some way contradictory, or I find it socially irresponsible to be that way. And it's a really hard thing, but a wonderful goal that we could have arguments at the center, substantive arguments about things, even just among professors and grad students, but also across religious boundaries that are not simply name-calling, but substantive, interesting disagreements where we learn. Susan, did you want to? Okay, but thank you for that.
Okay. The sacramental principle in the center was that there's a building, and that if there hadn't been a building, it would have been abolished within the first 5 years, because the neo-Orthodox climate of Protestant theology at the time didn't think there should be such a center. On the other hand, Wilfred Smith always insisted the center is people and not a building. And in that respect, he was Protestant. Reading Wilfred this time around, I was struck where he picked up on the theme that you were starting with, of the poetic meaning of how we try to express the transcendent. But then he reminded us that in the prophetic side of the biblical tradition is an iconoclastic streak, and in which you have to say no loudly and obnoxiously. I would say in Robert Slater's case, what he was saying no to was subscriptionism, where you have to subscribe to a dogma or I won't talk to you, as contrasted with confessional language in theology. In Wilfred's case, what he was saying loudly to was the attempt to make the study of religion a social scientific enterprise, because he saw that as turning people into things. I'm wondering what the two of you are going to say no to.
Actually, I was thinking about that. I was reading one of Rowan Williams's essays on Lasky's apophatic theology, and the sentence that jumped out at me was, apophasis is the response of the embodied being. And for me, that is very critical. What I will say no to is any attempt to contain with certitude a language of God and of the human other. I don't want to do that, because for me, apophasis, this stance of negating anything that I know or think I know, is a proper embodied response. So what I say no to is an account of God. And it's funny, I am a theologian, and I constantly do talk about how to talk about God. So in any case, what do I say no to? Very simply is that any certitude with regard to a proposition about God. To me, to have that is critical in our time.
I would add, I mean, I think out of the same spirit of Susan's response, I mean, I really am this kind of middle-of-the-road Irish Jesuit Catholic guy from New York. And the instinct that, you know, you can read in modern theologians like Jacques Dupuy, the Jesuit who taught in India for years and at the Greg, Robert de Nobly in the 17th century, that there's a kind of a capacious inclusion of reality, and that the thing to say no to is building walls instead of having crossable borders. And so when somebody says, well, we can't have theology in the academy, or we can't have conversations on the following issues, or I don't have time for the center because I'm too busy, those kinds of efforts of either accepting oneself or drawing the boundary and saying, we can't have this, we can't have that, we can't have ministry at a university, we can't have believers talking to one another in a university building. I would say no to all those kinds of things, because I think we always have to figure out ways of intellectual, spiritual hospitality to make conversations possible. But with Kevin's point, I mean, once we're actually deep in conversation, we can also say no on specific points about harmful practices, mistaken beliefs, and the like. But the general thing is say no to those who want to say no.
Thank you, Professor Clooney and Abraham. I was struck by a phrase that you used at the very beginning, which is to be what you teach, being what you teach. And the question I had is, what is the formative process of being what you teach via text? And using something Professor Abraham said, which is sort of, having a religiously grammared space, but one could also ask the question about a religiously grammared life. So what may be a religiously grammared life that is inspired or shaped by teaching or by reading or by being according to texts from multiple traditions? And especially if you could point to specific examples, I mean, what is the process of developing a being like that?
I mean, for me, I would say, first of all, again, that there are certainly other ways than I imagine or put forward for doing this, and all kinds of formative process that matter intellectually. But I have a very rich and demanding sense of what it means to study the text. So you can call it Lectio Divina, you can call it Swadhyaya. I mean, there are different ways in different traditions to talk about this. But the reverence for tradition, the patience with learning over a long period of time, the realization that when I read something vaguely, I think I get it. When I read it very closely, it becomes, you know, imponderable and full of all kinds of curiosities. That the process of hearing, as the Upanishad says, I mean, of hearing it, thinking about it, and then bringing it into some kind of meditative reflection is a process of formation. And I think we do this all the time, and we do this in our course, you know, syllabi. We do it in the curriculum. We do it always. And I think, in a sense, it's a very powerful process that we should not overlook, that the study of the text becomes central to a way of life, having a life such that text and study of text is possible. Now, again, as Susan, I think, is pointing out, you know, if that becomes a safe little world in which the boundaries are not critiqued, or in which I'm protecting myself by not looking out the window, then obviously that's a deformation that takes place. But I think even if you're reading a text and its commentary of any tradition, there are always all kinds of clues that point you out, and you don't really remain in. So it's you know, you could talk about Pierre Hadot's work or Hans-Georg Gadamer's work on this rich sense of interpretation, reading, meaning-making that I think is very powerful. That for me would be very formative. And that finally, to be able and unashamed to talk about that autobiographically now and then, like, why actually do you read that? Or how have you made your decisions about where your field has gone, and so on. I think we have time for maybe one more, and then we can head across the street and drink and so forth. I am Irish, you know. One more question or comment? See, now that I mentioned the reception, no one wants to tarry any longer. So maybe we should stop at that point. Thank you.